In this video, I'm going to go over categorizing boards by texture. I'm going to just use my own terminology that, how I divide boards into different categories, and just quickly go over what kind of properties each board has and how that helps us build our initial flop strategy. I'm just going to use the examples from the Winning Poker Tournaments course, the button versus big blind sim at 100 blinds. Keep in mind that as stacks get shallower, things will change a little bit, but in general, the concepts are the same. You'll just scale down if our big bet on a quote unquote dynamic board is 100% pot or 120% pot or whatever. When you're at 30 blinds instead of 100, it's going to be 60% or 70%, right? So all of these, you can take all of these fundamentals and then just use them, apply them at each stack depth. But as stacks shallow out, scale down the sizes. The concepts are the same. The ranges change, of course, when you start getting shoves versus you pre-flop. But basically, the concepts stay the same. Scale down the sizing, and also you're going to be allowed to be more aggressive on boards where out of position starts to lack some strong hands because he puts more money in pre-flop than he does on when we're deeper, right? So those are just the only things that'll change, but for the same concepts. So we're just going to look at a couple different boards, and I'll explain the properties of each one. So, of course, there's thousands of flops, and we could come up with a bunch of different nuanced textures why 8-4 deuce is different than 9-7-3, so on, right? But in general, I'm going to call them dynamic boards, which the way I view it and the way that I play this category of boards is this is a board where equities shift a ton in drastic ways. So like an 8-4 deuce rainbow, we're looking at an equity graph now of the in position player, 100 blinds button versus big blind, and we have hands like nines that are 78% equity here. So when aces and kings are 84 and 86 and nines is 78, that's a really strong hand, but it's so vulnerable, and as are all of our 8x here, right? So, but these hands are so vulnerable to equity shifts here that this becomes, even though it's a low offsuit board that's not super connected right now, I categorize this as a dynamic board because the nuts change really frequently, equities shift extremely. So when you've got a hand like nines or tens and you have the out of position player check calling, if you use a smaller bet and he can check call pretty comfortably with all those backdoor hands, then those hands are gonna go from having almost 80% equity to having a two outer versus some of these on any kind of like jack high plus turn card, or for nines obviously the 10 high, and for our 8x any kind of nine. So anything like this, like these gapped but connected offsuit hands where there's a lot of backdoors and a lot of overcards where a lot of our value hands are vulnerable and need protection but are strong enough equity hands to have a big bet, I classify as dynamic. So when you are seeing those boards, you're going to be thinking you want to mostly be playing a big or huge bet and check, and the deeper you are, the bigger your flop bet can be, but you don't have to worry about actually implementing an overbet. You can just play like a 90% pop bet here or check, and your range is going to check like half the time. So right off the bat, you're thinking, okay, are a lot of my really strong value hands vulnerable? Are there a lot of straight draws and backdoors that have equity versus me that can turn straights or top pairs that really start crushing some of my strong hands? Do the nuts change a bunch here? So that's going to be the case here too. There's so many different turn cards where the nuts change. So many different turn cards versus the big blind that just makes He makes two pairs. He can, like I said, make top pairs with his floats. He can gain some equity on these from a lot of his backdoors on these rainbow boards. So that's a board that people might see and use a small bet and say, okay, this is a dry board. No, I categorize this as a dynamic board and a board where we want to use our big size and start hammering money in. So the next category is I'll go over is just a really dry board where things just don't change too much, and that would be something like your King 8 Deuce Rainbow, your Ace 7 Deuce type, that like really disconnected. This is where an in position player at pretty much every position pair is going to get to bet a ton for the small size, because out of position just whiffs a lot. And in position gets to use a bunch of protection betting, and so basically these boards are the ones where we expect to just see pure bets from in position pretty much, because out of position has so many auto folds. When we use the small bet, there's really still not that much that can change. There's just not enough hands that can float and really change equities too much. So when we see high card, mid card, low card, super disconnected, and we're in position, that's our classic dry board scenario, and it's going to be the same on those ace 9-3 types, stuff like that. So that's a board where, we're thinking basically high card, mid card, low card, no connection whatsoever, pure bet, and not pure bet, but I mean one of the spots where you bet a ton and your checks just come from some hands that make sense, but everything can mix betting, and you don't have any big size, and equities just aren't going to change too much. The nuts isn't going to change too much, right? Like, if I have kings, if I have eights, if I have twos, if I have king 8 suited, those hands are just not that vulnerable. My ace king just isn't that vulnerable, right? Whereas a lot of our strong hands on some of these more dynamic, or what I'm going to go over next is a wet board, can change pretty frequently and go from, aces or kings having 85% equity on the 8-4 deuce, and then all of a sudden out of position bangs off one of those low mid cards and makes it straight, and we're drawing dead. So that's not going to happen on a board like this, and that's why this is dry and the other is dynamic, even though they're both seemingly not hitting ranges very hard. So the next one will be, it falls into the category of dynamic in the sense that some equities will shift a good amount, but it starts out with a spot where like both players, so this one's going to be a queen 10-9 with a flush draw, and yeah, like flush cards can change equities fast, straight cards too. The nuts just isn't going to change that much because it's like king jack's just not that vulnerable, only with a flush. So I categorize this more as a wet board, even though equities do shift. We're still running really close. The nuts don't change as much. Like if you have a set and the out of position turns to straight, you still have pretty good equity. It's not like you're going from having 85% to almost 0 in some cases, or 85% to like 12 or whatever. You're gonna have equities are gonna run close pretty much the whole time. So this is a wet board where hand strengths do change quite a bit, but since the equities is like change back and forth a lot on a lot of different runouts, both players play these boards really cautious, and not a lot of money goes in from each position, and that's kind of how I like to think of these. So I would stick to thinking of those low disconnected boards where equities shift drastically, as like your big bet boards that you want to check your unmade hands and put a lot of money in with your made hands and your best bluffs. And this like wet board, I treat this as what I call a wet board, which means things can change a lot, but you're not ever really putting a bunch of money in here. Your biggest bet on the flops you probably want is like 60, maybe a little bit of big size. And then, when out of position does face that small bet, his check raise is still pretty reasonable. It's just blocker stuff and some good flush draw type stuff. So it's like a straight draw, flush draw, blocker stuff. So they're not going to go crazy versus you. And both players are going to be pretty cautious, and equities are going to run pretty close. And you can kind of extrapolate this to a lot of different three mid cards where there's a straight and a flush draw. Those are what I like to call the wet boards, where we can expect to not make a mistake by just the hands that make sense. And as you can see, in position right off the bat here has a pretty good equity advantage on boards like this because the big blind, when we're in late position, the big blind is 3-betting a lot of suited broadways and stuff. But in any case, even with a good equity advantage, we're using a lot of small size because, like we said, the board changes quite a bit. So that's one of our categories of wet boards, and we're just thinking small size, nothing crazy, c-betting quite often, checking the hands that make the most sense. So those ones would be, some of our, usually in these spots, it's just like the pocket pairs right below bottom pair are our most frequent checks. So like if it's queen 10-9, we see the 8, 7, 6s. They're good enough to work to showdown, and they're not really hands that are looking to bluff. But then once we get to the 2s and 3s, we go back to c-betting. So yeah, just an overall really aggressive strategy and really linear and mergy, as opposed to the other type of dynamic board where we're super polar and really focused on our highest equity hands. This one, we're kind of betting all over the place and doing a lot of bluffing, doing a lot of barreling, whereas the other dynamic board, we are really equity driven with our c-bets and really passive with our high card like ace queen types. And the last board I'll go over in this video are the boards where it is dry, like ace, king, deuce, rainbow. The nuts aren't going to change too much here, but it's a dry board that we play polarized because we don't have protection concerns. So it shares a lot of it shares similarities to the classic dry board in the sense that nuts don't change too much, but on a lot of these boards in a lot of different spots, we see in position playing a little bit more polar in a lot of spots. When you're late position, you will play it very similarly to like a king 8 deuce, but once you're in some 3-bet pots, or once you're in some out of position pots on a board like this, you see a lot of big betting or checking because a lot of your hands that don't need protection just want to check. So that's kind of a board where you want to track it as position as this situation changes. If you're in 3-bet pots, if you're in single raise pots out of position, this is going to be a board that you want to play a lot more polar than the other types of dry boards. It doesn't really apply for this button versus big blind sim because out of position 3-bets so many of his good hands, and we have so much wide stuff that we want to c-bet that it plays kind of like classic dry board here. But in general, in a lot of other spots, that'll be a board where you're going to end up playing more polarized because you just don't have a lot of hands that want protection and the nuts don't change a bunch. Other types of boards that we don't need to pull up the sim and just talk quickly are just boards where you they're dynamic in the sense that they're boards where out of position has a polarized equity distribution, right? So we talk about that on paired boards where out of position is going to have a lot of air and a lot of trips, or ace wheel boards like an ace 4-5 where out of position is going to have a bunch of two pairs and straight draws and a lot of air. So we play the boards where we identify out of position as having either really strong hands or a bunch of air really passively in position, and it's a combination of protecting ourselves but also letting them catch up, because like when we put a bunch of money in with a linear range against a range that's polarized, meaning like if we're betting pocket on an ace 4-5, we're just getting folds, or we're putting more money, or we're putting money in versus some made hands and draws that are doing really well against us, and we're probably going to get put in a tough spot. Whereas we're happy to put money in with something like tens on a king 8 deuce for protection and value. There's just not a lot of stuff that out of position can do to mess us up at equilibrium there. So the last category I would say is identify, and there's a bunch of different boards where this can happen, but identify when an out of position range is going to be concentrated on really strong hands and a bunch of air, and that's a spot where we want to do a lot of checking and playing kind of passively, and that'll happen on monotone boards too. So but yeah, those are my main classifications. There are the classic dry board, the dynamic board that is kind of low but sneakily connected, and the other player in the pot has a lot of backdoors. The wet board where things change a lot, but we still play really aggressive for the small size in position. And the dry board where when we're in late position, we play it kind of normal, but when we're in earlier position with a tighter range, we play it more polarized. So if we looked at this sim from early position on an ace king deuce, we'd see a lot of big betting and checking. Once we get later, it plays more like a normal dry board, so that's an important classification to make as well. And then, when the big blind has these, passive boards where the big blind's equity is distributed among strong hands and air, like an ace wheel, like maybe some monotone boards, especially against the small blind flat and stuff like that. So that's just a couple notes on board texture. So thanks, guys.